Hey everybody, and welcome to DnD Horror Stories with DnD Doge. In today's video, we have a story about how Chick-fil-A destroys a Dungeons & Dragons group. A story about a dungeon master that comes up with a stupid and disgusting excuse to take away a Paladin player's powers, and a whole lot more. But before we get into those, if you would like to help me and the channel out, liking and commenting on the video is the best way to do so. Also, I would ask that you consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you haven't already. That way, you never miss a video, and in turn, never miss any of the kitties, like Simba. But with that YouTube stuff out of the way, let's get into some D&D horror stories. Dungeon Master TPK's Party over Chick-fil-A by Reddit user Absolute Sub-Zero 99. So I play D&D with some friends. Our forever DM usually hosts the games at his dorm. This was our most recent campaign, as we haven't played D&D at all since. I think I may try to Dungeon Master in the future though. Our game was a time travel campaign that involved us trying to stop this evil Time Lord. Our actions had a lot of weight in this campaign, as anything we did in the Prime Material Plane, a homebrewed world, the Shadowfell, or Feywild, would affect the future. The Dungeon Master also homebrewed some time spells, so most of us ended up choosing magical classes. A wizard, warlock, bard, druid, and me, a paladin. We started off in this quaint town, and then set out, found some Atlantis-style ruins, and then went to the grand city of Tyloria, the capital of a great empire, where the Time Lord's minions, who were demons, some low level enough for us to fight and survive, attacked it and destroyed it. We then fled to a secretive city-state that the Time Lord had not ravaged yet, and found a time crystal that gave us access to the near future, which was post-apocalyptic and hellish, made to look like the Time Lord's fiery empire in the Nine Hells, in which itself was unaffected by time travel. Now, this is where I need to add some context about our real-life group dynamics. As I mentioned, we met at our DM's dorm, and we were all good friends. We would come over to his place on Saturdays, eat some food, usually from on campus, play D&D, and then play video games and talk about life until we went home. One day, however, Warlock's player suggested that we eat something good for once and go off campus. Dungeon Master suggested Chick-fil-A. He loved Chick-fil-A and hadn't been there in forever because it was so far away and he doesn't drive. Wizard's player said he wanted some Mexican food from around that same area, so he'd go out and get it. We all agreed to get our food from around that area too, and we ordered our food. Dungeon Master said he wanted 2 spicy chicken sandwiches, a frosted lemonade, extra ranch, and a large order of waffle fries. Okay, now I'm hungry. He texted his order to the group chat as well. We then gave Wizard's player the money, and he went off to get our food. Unfortunately, I don't know if Wizard's player forgot or the restaurant screwed it up, because they gave him a regular chicken sandwich, and no ranch. Dungeon Master was like, "Is this regular? I said spicy, and where's the ranch? That's like the best part. Come on, man." Wizard's player then just said, "Stop being a baby and just eat the damn sandwich." Dungeon Master then said, "I even gave you a tip." Wizard's player then said, "There's no real difference between the spicy and regular anyway," which enraged the DM as they started arguing and escalating until this was now a full-blown shouting match. I was afraid that hands were going to get thrown until the Dungeon Master just said, "Let's just get back to the effing game." And we did. As DM barely touched his sandwich, we picked up as the party returned to the past in order to figure out how to stop the BBEG. But when we returned, we were greeted by an infernal knight who told us that time is the domain of the Time Lord, not lowlives like us, and then immediately attacked us. We were level 3, and he was a challenge rating 20 monster. We had no chance and got TPK'd on the spot. We all were upset and tried to protest, but the Dungeon Master just said that it was a skill issue, till Wizards player just called him out for doing this, and I quote, "over an effing sandwich." And DM just said, "Like I said, skill issue. You couldn't get a basic order right. Maybe God made intelligence and wisdom your dump stat." Wizards player just stormed out, and the rest of us just were kind of silent for a second, and then we left too. Like I said, we haven't had a game since. DM apologized to the rest of us, except Wizards player, for the TPK, but said he still doesn't want to DM anymore. Wizards player and the DM aren't talking, and we are all just kind of sad that our friend group has been soured by this. TLDR, friend group and D&D campaign gets ruined over a Chick-fil-A order. Well, that certainly is an overreaction to getting a wrong order from a fast food place. Plus, it isn't really fair to the other players. I can't imagine throwing away what sounded like a really interesting campaign and homebrew world that I'm sure the DM spent a lot of time building, all over a frickin' chicken sandwich. Dungeon Master definitely overreacted here, but Wizard isn't totally blame-free either. The way he was so dismissive about the whole ordeal tells me that he was the one that got the order wrong, not the restaurant. And I'm sorry, there is a big difference between the spicy and regular. That being, the spicy is better, and I agree with DM that ranch on it is really good. Though I haven't had Chick-fil-A, since they obviously shrunk the patties on their sandwiches, but I digress. This whole ordeal is so childish, and hopefully the Dungeon Master and Wizard player realize how silly it is to stay mad at each other over this, and they can retcon the TPK and continue the game down the road. Let's move on to the next post. So bad, it blew up a friendship. By Reddit user Mortlack78. This was about a decade ago. We started playing a campaign of Traveler. It has been so long that I had to go and look up the name of the system. And we had made characters and had a fun first session. It was a group of 6. The Dungeon Master and 5 players, including me, 4 of whom were colleagues, and the 5th was a Dungeon Master for a D&D campaign we were also playing at the time. I think it was session 2 or 3, when we found ourselves with a crashed alien spaceship with a ludicrous technology level. Neat. We figured that we would learn to use it or sell it for a large fortune. But then the army showed up, and it was quite clear that the ship was meant as a story hook, and not an actual thing we would get. So there is a little bit of bickering between the players and the army outside, and 3 of us see the writing on the wall and come out peacefully. But then it all went to crap. The remaining 2 players decide to make that effing ship their Alamo, ready to defend it to the death. The Dungeon Master clearly struggled and kept trying to persuade the players to surrender peacefully, but they would have none of it. This went on for 3 hours, with the Dungeon Master trying desperately not to kill the 2 players. By this point, the Dungeon Master is exasperated, and the 2 other players and I are bored out of our skulls. So I finally just say to the DM, just kill them already. This seemed to be the prod that the DM needed, and the 2 players in the ship were fragged with a grenade or something. All of this was pretty bad, but then one of those players had the gall to say, "You didn't even give us a chance." Even the Dungeon Master's partner, who was playing, and who I thought to be congenially incapable of feeling anger, got really mad. There was shouting, and the two players were kicked out of the DM's home. We never spoke to the non-colleague player again, and not much to the colleague either. Well, that whole thing could have been handled better on all fronts, in my opinion. I think the Dungeon Master let those two players try to hold on to that ship for way too long. I'd say after the first 30 minutes, if they still refused to come out, that would have been the time to get them out. Though the Dungeon Master didn't need to just off the characters. He could have had the grenade be a stun grenade or something like that. Or heck, even just talk to the players above table about how this ship was just supposed to be a plot device, and to please just go along with the other characters. Though that isn't how things played out. And I do also have to say that the players that were in the ship should have realized that they weren't going to win, especially after 3 hours, and should have just given up. Then, for them to yell at the Dungeon Master and claim that he didn't even give them a chance is pretty dumb. I mean, he did give them 3 freaking hours, which again, I say they shouldn't have had that long in the first place. Like I said, this whole game sounded like a mess on all fronts, and it is a shame that it ended friendships. Though, if something like this could end a friendship, could you really call it that? I don't know, but I've rambled on long enough about this story, so let's move on to the next one. Dungeon Master takes away my Paladin's powers because I stopped a rape. By Reddit user SatisfactionSilly465. I usually play with friends, but we all moved across the country after graduating, and I still wanted to play D&D in person, so I joined a local group. The campaign was on the dark and gritty side of things, but was mostly pretty fun at first. Unfortunately, it didn't last. I was playing an Oath of Devotion Paladin, fairly straight-laced. Very much a traditional Lawful Good type character. The party had just arrived in a border town, and was waiting for a courier when my Paladin sees a thug dragging a young elf girl into an alleyway. Obviously, I decide to follow him. The Dungeon Master proceeds to describe the thug forcing the girl against the wall and tearing at her clothes. I've heard enough and decide to attack. One smite later, and the thug is dead. The Dungeon Master turns to me and says, smugly, that my Paladin instantly feels his power dissipate, leaving him a level 4 fighter. The party was level 8 at this point. His justification was that the country we had just entered was really racist towards elves, so they had no legal rights at all. So the rapist was not committing any crimes at all, so my Paladin had just murdered a guy, and was thus no longer lawful. I protest that A. Lawful good does not mean blindly following the laws, and B. That's not how Paladin oaths work anyway. But the Dungeon Master wouldn't budge, so I decided just to leave that table. Holy crap, what a scumbag thing to do. This Dungeon Master was definitely looking for a gotcha moment for an excuse to take OP's powers away. He knew full well that a lawful good paladin would help someone in distress, and OP did what I hope any lawful good character would do, regardless if there was no law against that in that country. And OP is right in saying that whichever god his character gave him his powers wouldn't evaluate an action based on what the laws of whichever country the party found themselves in. I say good on OP for leaving right after that, because that is total BS, and that Dungeon Master was definitely just trying to find a reason to nerf OP's character. Not to mention the fact that nobody else at the table called the DM out on that. Here is hoping that OP can find a new table to play at, where the DM is not a total ass. let's move on. Player is threatening to leave campaign by Reddit user Simply Trusting. I know the easy answer here is let him quit, but hear me out. Since he's a good friend of some of my players, and I want to be in the right if this turns ugly. My player, which we'll call Terry, is a huge fan of board games. He's also a fan of the 5e combat system, and really enjoys trying to use his spells and features in some crazy ways, making combat very technical and playing it more like a war game. I usually let him to some degree, but I try to rein it in before it gets out of hand. But this has led to a lot of disagreements and arguments in the past. I, the Dungeon Master, like to focus on role-playing, as making a story together with my players feels more rewarding to me than constantly running them through dungeon after dungeon. But when there is to be combat, I like and want it to be fast-paced and intense. Terry's newest character is a druid that focuses on manipulating water. For example, he will use sleep to knock out enemies, and then use shape water to make them drown. Wow, now that is stretching what shape water can do. You would think not being able to breathe would awaken anything affected by the sleep spell. That, and there would need to be a source of water nearby. We got into a bit of a debate last session. They were fighting some goblins by the bank of a river, and Terry used shaped water to turn the surface of a portion of the river into ice. He argued that a 5-foot cube of water holds multiple cubic liters of water, so by the spell's definition, he could turn that same amount of water into ice, which equaled about a 5x5 sheet of ice instead of a 5-foot square. I didn't feel like halting the entire encounter to argue, so I rolled with it. As the goblins walked out onto the ice, Terry wanted to use shape water to turn chunks of ice back into water, dropping the goblins into the river. For the sake of keeping the peace, I let him, and Terry had a grand old time. After the session, I messaged him privately, and told him that, from now on, I wanted to stay more true to what the book says the spell actually does, for the sake of keeping things as simple as possible, as I don't want to run overly technical encounters like those. Long story short, Terry said that if he wasn't allowed to be creative when using his spells, and had to play only off what the book says, he wouldn't really enjoy combat anymore, and that it would probably be best if he found another group. I told him that I'd give it some thought, and try to come up with a solution that benefits both of us. I'm really close to just letting Terry quit. We rarely see eye to eye when it comes to D&D. In other simpler systems, we get along much better, and I've spent hours looking at homebrew spells, features, races, trying to balance totally bonkers homebrew that isn't even mine to keep Terry happy and having fun, but I'm about to reach my limit. Would I be the bad guy here for telling Terry to either deal with it or take a hike? Well, first off, I have to make the correction that shape water isn't a spell, it's a cantrip, and with all the things that Terry wanted to do with it, really stretched what shape water could do. It sounds like OP is going above and beyond to try to keep Terry happy, but even that is not enough, since when OP stated that they would like to start going more by the book, Terry gave OP that ultimatum. I don't think OP would be the a-hole here if he just let Terry leave. Though there is more to this story, as OP posted an update, so let's see how things went. Edit. Thank you everyone for commenting, regardless if you think Terry is in the wrong, or that I'm the dullest DM on the Northern Hemisphere. This somewhat blew up, and I'm having a hard time replying to all of you, but I appreciate you all. After talking with Terry and hearing what he had to say, and voicing my own concerns, I realized that I'm not able to run the type of campaign that Terry wants to play in, and we came to the conclusion that it would be best for Terry to look for another group to play with for a while that suits his playstyle more. Thank you everyone for your advice and wisdom. You were of great help. Well, at least it sounds like they figured things out, and Terry is no longer going to be a problem for OP. Though, I get a feeling that Terry is going to have a hard time finding a dungeon master that will allow such a liberal use of the shape water cantrip. Now, I can understand the rule of cool and all, but what Terry wanted was a bit much if you ask me. Though, what are your thoughts on this one? I'm legit curious. Let's move on. Pressured to drink underage and then kicked out of the campaign over it. By Reddit user Shroomish. This was the first long-term campaign I was ever in. It was in 2014 when I was 19. My boyfriend, 21 at the time, was our dungeon master, but the games were hosted by a couple who owned their own home. The other players varied a lot in age. There were 2 guys that were in their early 20s. Our hosts were a married straight couple in their early 30s, and another guy who was almost 40. Everyone else at the table was aware of my age from day one. Because everyone, except me, obviously, was of age, drinking casual at the table was commonplace. For the most part, people held it together, but there had been a couple of times where people got a little too tipsy, and we had to call a session early. We played with them for about 8 months, and met weekly, pretty consistently the entire time. Every single session, the wife would offer me a drink. I felt weird about it, especially since she was so much older than me, and I would turn her down, until the last time I played with them. I had a long week, just gotten off work, and decided, F it, and I drank 2 beers throughout our almost 5-hour session. I drank somewhat regularly at this point, definitely too regularly, and the 2 beers didn't really have much of an effect on me. She made a joke about how impressive my tolerance was, because I, quote, don't drink, and I clarified that I do drink. I just didn't do it outside of my own home, typically. After that day, on short notice, both times on the day of the game, and without any real explanation, she canceled the next 2 sessions. The day the second canceled session should have taken place, her husband called my boyfriend and said that they didn't feel comfortable having me in their home because I had been drinking there and I was underage. We were both super confused, so my boyfriend asked for clarification. The guy acknowledged that yes, his wife had offered me the drink, and then the second one when I went to toss the first bottle, knowing I was underage. But she didn't expect me to accept, and didn't know how to backtrack at that point, and tell me that it actually made her uncomfortable. The wildest part was that they expected my boyfriend to continue DMing for them. Wow, that is such BS. Offering OP drinks at almost every session, and the one time OP accepts, the wife gets bad feelings about it and just decides to kick OP from coming over, instead of just talking to them about why it made her uncomfortable. It sounds to me like OP was actually more mature than her. Then, to have the gall to think that OP's boyfriend would continue dungeon mastering for them after kicking out his significant other. That is just wild. Hopefully, OP and their boyfriend eventually found other people to play with. Ones that wouldn't contribute to the delinquency of minors. On to the next one. The players want to limit the Dungeon Master's influence. By Reddit user Grand Red Larceny. So this is something that has never really happened to me before. I've been a Dungeon Master for a while. Not extremely experienced or anything like that, but I've run a few games. A few weeks ago, I started talking to someone I know, and they mentioned that they had a group of friends looking for a dungeon master, and asked if I could do it. Since I really like Dungeons & Dragons, I didn't think twice and said, sure. I met with this group for a session 0 of sorts to discuss what they were looking for in a game. Here's what they told me. They wanted someone to run Curse of Strahd for them, which is fine. That is one of my favorite modules, but that's where problems came up. I told them that I'd be happy to, as Curse of Strahd actually has a lot of variables and ways to make things interesting. That was when a player stopped me mid-sentence and said, "Before you start, I want to make sure you're running it for us without change. I want you to not influence the module at all. Don't even change a comma. I hate when dungeon masters think they know better than the folks at D&D." That was strange, to say the least, but I understand wanting to run something as it was intended, and I said that I would definitely follow the module. However, the player continued, "No, you shouldn't even use dialogue that isn't in the module, okay? That's how D&D is meant to be played. Also, you need to roll dice out in the open for us to see." Things felt really strange to me. I know I'm not experienced or anything, but this didn't feel normal, so I asked them, plainly, what they were expecting of me. And this one player, who seemed to be speaking for the group, said, "We hate when DMs abuse their powers to manipulate the world. That's why we only play modules and make sure the dungeon masters don't change a single thing from them." I imagine my expression didn't seem too good when he said that, because what followed were a bunch of complaints about dungeon masters. And for me, it sounded way too close to player versus dungeon master mentality. It went on for a while, but there was no way I was DMing for them. I'm barely experienced enough to deal with normal players, and to me, this definitely isn't normal. Honestly, at that point, they were expecting me to be an AI simulator for their game with a voice, which is not at all what I'm looking for. I told them that, and that we weren't going to be a good fit. As expected, they didn't like my response, and started to angrily shout that I was wasting their time, that I was not a quote, true DM, etc. That being said, I will no longer be DMing for this group, or for anyone that this friend of mine introduces me to. I'm just glad that it didn't go beyond a session 0. Sheesh, talk about being entitled. To make all those demands on a person they just met that is willing to spend their time and effort to be a dungeon master for them. It did really sound like they just wanted OP to act like some AI dungeon master to run them through a module. I mean, to demand that OP not deviate from anything written in the source book, even NPC dialogue. I'm not even sure how that would work. The dungeon master is supposed to roleplay as the characters in the book, and how is he supposed to do that if he can't have the NPCs react to what the player characters do? Then, when OP said that they didn't think that they were a good fit, the players had the gall to say that OP was wasting their time. I kinda see that as the other way around. Like OP said, it is a good thing that this didn't go beyond a session 0, and OP didn't have to waste their time DMing for these people. But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you, especially if you like, comment, and subscribe, and may your games remain horror story free. Until next time.